This week on Act Out, a special episode dedicated to the past that built our present that'll dictate our future. We take a brief look at the upcoming bicentenary of Karl Marx's birthday, and then we dive deep into May 1st, International Workers' Day. We sit down with Alka Mysore of IWW and Socialist Alternative to hear about the historic cover-ups, the importance of recognizing May Day, and the path ahead. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Rockets! Blockade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. An orange flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I awoke next to the body of my baby. No!
This special episode of Act Out, and indeed all of our episodes of Act Out, are partially funded by patrons, and we depend on patronage to keep us acting out, as we are 100% independent, non-corporatized news. So to become a patron of our work, visit patreon.com/actout. Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. So next Tuesday is May 1st, International Workers' Day, and the following Saturday, May 5th, is the 200th anniversary of Karl Marx's birth. Needless to say, these two upcoming dates give us a lot to think about, in the past, but also thinking forwards. Indeed, we must look back in order to understand our present, and in order to plan for our future. And what's perhaps most striking between both the anniversary of May Day and the anniversary of Karl Marx's birth is the fact that we're facing the same problems today that we faced back then. We're certainly staring down the ills of capitalism that Marx outlines in his work, and as the World Socialist website remarked in their commentary on the bicentennial, this new year of 2018, the bicentenary of Marx's birth, will be characterized above all by an immense intensification of social tensions and an escalation of class conflict around the world. And be it Fight for 15, teacher strikes, tree sits in the path of pipelines, outcries against police brutality, or the Me Too movement, it's clear that tensions are high, and the gaping chasms between the haves and the have-nots, the oppressors and the oppressed, the rich and the poor, are more and more visible to those on the losing side. It's getting harder for the powers that be to make excuses for gross inequalities. The pressure of oppression is reaching a breaking point. And the question then, of course, is, who's going to break? If you watch this show, you know that I'm not a blind optimist at all. More so a realist with hope and an appetite for historical connections. And this is why it's so important to recognize and learn from May 1st. Because what was born in 1886 gave rise not only to the 8-hour workday and the weekend that you enjoy today, but to worker fights worldwide and workers' rights suppression here at home. On May 1st, 1886, more than 300,000 people walked off their jobs across the U.S. After years of pleading and appealing for an 8-hour workday and safer working conditions, only to be met with Pinkerton's beatings and continuous harassment, workers had had it. Chicago was the epicenter of this fight and would become infamous for what is now known as the Haymarket Affair, or the Haymarket Riots, or the Haymarket Massacre. On May 4th, a public meeting was called to address the police brutality dealt out during the previous days of peaceful striking and protest. By this point, nearly 100,000 workers in Chicago had walked off their jobs, and at Haymarket Square that evening, a crowd of roughly 3,000 gathered to hear comments by anarchist organizers, workers, and even the mayor of Chicago was in attendance. And the crowd showed no signs of rowdiness or violence, but continued resolve was apparent. As the meeting wound down, cops started to roughly disperse the crowd, and shortly thereafter, a bomb was thrown into police ranks. No one knows who did it. Blame quickly fell on anarchist organizers who were tried and 4 of which were hung, not so much for their actions, but rather their political beliefs, which was made blatantly clear by the fact that only 3 out of 8 people tried were even there at Haymarket when the bomb was thrown. Some suggest that the culprit was a police agitator trying to get the police to fire, which of course they did. Some 11 people died and upwards of 100 were injured. Now, fast forward to today, and May 1st is officially recognized in 66 countries around the world, but not, incidentally, in the country where it began. Rather, here in the US, May 1st is recognized as Law Day. No shit. Proclaimed by President Eisenhower in 1958 in the midst of the Cold War, the goal was to label anything to do with workers' rights, class conflict, or economic injustice as communist, and therefore thoroughly un-American and hateful, despite the fact that May Day is, of course, very American. Unfortunately, though, the Cold War efforts have worked in the system's favor. It's not just May 1st that we don't celebrate. We largely don't celebrate or recognize the movements whose hard-won gains that we reap today. The history of our struggle as the 99% has been washed with McCarthyist rags, stained with the propaganda of a system dead set on profit at any price, paid by both people and planet. This is dangerous. It's a disservice to those who gave much, some who gave all, but it's also a handicap on our current fights. Without history to explain the present, we move into the future blind. We build on foundations we know nothing about, rehashing old mistakes, unaware of what worked and what didn't in the past. So on this May Day, instead of letting the ones who erased our history erase our potential future, let's consider the past, so that we can build the future that we, the people, want. Here to talk more about May Day, its importance, and the road ahead is Alka, Mysore, organizer with Industrial Workers of the World and Socialist Alternative. Take a look. Talk about the history of the U.S. squashing, not just of the history of the labor movement, but of current labor movements as well.
Certainly. Everyone might have heard of the Supreme Court case, Janus versus AFSCME, where a prominent right-to-work foundation is actually funding this onslaught against public sector unions, where they want workers to have union protections without paying union dues, which will basically stifle any union activity. And you know that it's politically motivated. It's often motivated by, or you know, brought out by the right wing or the conservative wing in politics. But not only that, there's so much repression of working people. Even if there is not even if there's no formal labor organizing in many sectors, workers don't feel empowered to do much in the United States. I mean, if compare the labor organizing in the United States with France for a second. Right now, what's going on in France is Macron, the president, has he's putting forward a lot of reforms to the labor movement, where he's encouraging private companies to kind of participate in the public sector, specifically in the railway industry. And railway workers in France are going on this strike up through June of this year, where they'll work for a couple of days and then take time off during the week in order to kind of show to Macron and the president and the private sector that they're not going to go down easy. Of course, in the United States too, there's the teachers strikes are tremendous, and it's amazing. And I really want to give a shout out to teachers and workers in southern states, which are historically not known to be progressive. With West Virginia, the students in Florida striking too is an important event. Kentucky, Arizona teachers, Oklahoma teachers, they're all uniting to strike, and I think that this momentum should continue. The government will pit workers against each other, even within, across sectors and within the same sector. For instance, they'll say, oh, the teachers are so selfish. They want, they're so greedy. What about other public sector workers? But I think the response is what the Teamsters suggested is stand in solidarity with striking workers, because an injury to one is an injury to all.
Talk about how May Day is celebrated or recognized by people here in the U.S. despite of the U.S. trying to clamp down on it.
Definitely. In most recent memory, I think if people recall, last year on May Day, immigrant workers went on strike. They followed up after a strike in February in the year, and then on May 1st, especially in DC locally, a lot of immigrant workers, many of them in the restaurant industry, went on strike. This happened, I think, back in 2006 as well, and then on a smaller scale in 2016. So May Day is celebrated, maybe sparsely in a lot of places. Some cities in the United States have I think, a stronger history of celebrations of May Day. Minneapolis comes to mind. They have a very large parade, and it's very beautiful, filled with puppets and things like that. It's truly a celebration of the working class. And in DC, we've had a history of over 40 years celebrating May Day every single year. So DC May Day specifically is a day to not only celebrate our achievements as workers, but also bring to the forefront our struggles, the same issues that we will, I think, perpetually deal with until we change the system in its entirety. Whether it's related to immigration, dreamers, the onslaught on working class people, calling them illegal immigrants, whether it's sexism, rampant racism that continues in the United States, and it takes different, almost more creative forms the more you clamp down on it or the more you address it. And I think underlying all these issues is the issue of capitalism, because the ruling class truly wants us to fight for crumbs among ourselves and keep us from uniting. And my hope is that May Day becomes a day when we can all unite against the issues that we all have to fight with in varying capacities.
Yeah, and that's really important that you said that, because capitalism is something that we all suffer under, regardless of where we live, how we live, what we do, where we work, and things like that. We're all suffering under the same system, which is something that I've brought up on the show as well before. So I want to touch on the idea of May Day today, and I'll get to the organizations that you're involved with in a second. But has organizing this event changed any under Trump, or is it just sort of that, oh, now we have a more overt example of what was happening before? Has it changed or has it not changed? How do you see that?
The problem, and I think more and more people are beginning to recognize, is that it doesn't matter which of the two major political parties we are presented with as choices, they all ultimately report back to and work for the capitalist class. These are, the people that I think pull all the strings are people we don't necessarily see or we don't necessarily think are bad people. We look at their philanthropy and charity and assume, they deserve all this money, they deserve all this power, but ultimately there's whether or not we recognize it right away, there is a pretty concerted effort on the part of the ruling class to keep all the power and all the wealth that we generate with them. And I don't think that it's going to change until all of us unite and truly begin to work towards changing the system and changing ownership and changing control. Working people produce everything. Working people, we make everything, and why shouldn't we then own everything that we make? And I think that should be the ultimate purpose of celebration of May Day and everything that we fight for. Not just to certainly fighting for reforms in the immediate term is necessary and encouraged, and we should do it, but we have to go one step beyond that too.
Yeah, and I think you brought up the good point of making this not just about workers of any certain industry, but just saying that this is really a human rights issue, because under this system, we are all feeding the beast that is the capitalist system and feeding the tycoons and the 1%, regardless of where we work and how we work. Our taxes go to fund the war machine and fund billionaire subsidies. So I want to shift now to talk about the organizations that you organize with, starting with IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. So one of the questions that I feel I should start with, because I think it's important for people to recognize, how is this union different than, say, SEIU or AFL-CIO?
Okay. The Industrial Workers of the World is a radical union. It's explicitly a union that is designed to unite workers of all industries, and that's why it's called the Industrial Workers of the World. The IWW, you can become a member of the IWW irrespective of what sector you work in, and so it's not designed to silo off different working class people in different industries, and it's not designed to, and which is how I think a lot of the modern and
Right.
more corporate unions are designed. The other thing is there are no bosses in the IWW, so you don't really have a union leader or a union, but you certainly have delegates and stewards who are doing their jobs as union organizers, but you don't have bosses who make all the decisions.
Right.
It's a very it's a democratic union, and all the decision making is also done democratically. A lot of anarcho-syndicalists are part of the IWW. A lot of socialists and communists are part of the IWW. And the IWW has had a lot of success, in the years past. Certainly it's over 100 years old, but also recently in union organizing. Recently in Tacoma Park, Silver Spring, there's a cooperative, a member-owned cooperative called the TPSS Co-op, and the IWW unionized the workers there, who they work and live in Montgomery County and only make $11.50 an hour at a fairly a Whole Foods type health co-op. And I think that workers should be paid enough to be able to purchase the products that they're trying to sell. And so that's sort of an example of the IWW's recent successes here, at least in DC.
Talk about how it's important as well for IWW not just to connect workers of different industries, but to connect issues as well.
Oh, definitely. I think that it's very easy, but also quite limiting for workers to focus on one thing at a time, because and I understand, and it's understandable that some issues touch us more deeply and hurt us more than other issues. But at the same time, I think we all, I think, are beginning to understand really, and a lot of us already understand, that the root cause of all of the issues we face is a system that kind of benefits profit making over actually benefiting sort of human welfare and human development. It's important for us to connect all these issues, because I think each issue potentially resonates with a person differently, and that's the goal, is to bring people in based on the issues that resonate with them, but ultimately unite us all to fight towards resolving all of those issues. And there's only so much we can do individually, and there's only so much we can do even as a small group that's focused on a specific thing. But when we join forces, we can achieve so much more. And that's exactly what the people at the top don't want us to do. They don't want us to unite. They want us to, like I was saying before, fight over crumbs, over just one specific issue that's dear to us, and they pit us against each other. And I see that happen all the time, just even within the activist community, where we tend to look at issues and using sort of these different lenses. And I understand some things are more urgent and important to resolve than others, but at the same time, I think we can't lose sight of the end goal. And the end goal is truly to build a system that benefits us all, to build a system that allows all of us to do more than just work and fight and worry about paying rent and worry about feeding our kids, and those things should all be taken care of, so that we can pursue greater and better interests, every single one of us.
Yeah, and that really speaks to the solidarity idea.
Absolutely.
That even if my issue isn't your issue, we can work together. And nobody should stop what they're doing if they're working on an issue, but open yourself up and recognize that other people are working on other issues, and you can help each other. Your fights can get louder and stronger by working together, as opposed to having the blinders on, which again, as you mentioned, is part of that divide and conquer concept of the system, to sort of like silo everybody off, and so that there's just like one environmentalist over here and then one like feminist over here, and so it's broken up like that.
And I do want to add that kind of adding blinders really alienates people from each other. I think that if we just talked a little bit more just amongst ourselves, we would know that we share 3 or 4 issues that we don't really feel empowered to kind of deal with on our own. I really think that uniting despite our differences, and I believe that a lot of our differences are superficial, even though I do want to acknowledge that some of us deal with far worse are especially women and people of color and trans people in this country certainly have dealt with a lot of lot of problems over the decades. But I still believe that if we united, despite our superficial differences and immutable qualities, we could do so much.
Well, and that also makes me think of another issue that I've sort of talked about in my organizing and activist circles, is the tendency to infight, and oftentimes based on a misunderstanding or something, using the wrong language in describing someone or something, and how that then devolves to this sort of grudge and this sort of infighting that only perpetuates the divisive nature of a lot of parts of the left. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how we might be able to sort of counter the infighting, and instead of like lashing out at people who might not know the right terminology or might be coming from totally different backgrounds, like how can we try to get together without going on the offensive and breaking those bonds before they even get a chance to be built?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question, and I have kind of a long-winded response, but hopefully it'll make sense. I was recently in Russia because I found cheap tickets to visit, and last year was the 100-year anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, so it was very interesting for me to see some of the places and some of the things that places of importance that 100 years ago they were very, very important. And then sort of one of the things I learned in going through these museums and learning a little bit more was just how much infighting there was, even at that time, even though it's especially for leftists, it's a pretty successful revolution. One of the things I wonder is, as human beings, maybe there's always going to be a little bit of that. We'll have conflicts and we'll have issues, but at the same time, as human beings, we've shown over the grand totality of our evolution that we are very capable of cooperation, when where we can come together and produce very, very good results. The capitalists do it, they're as long as it's about keeping their wealth and their power intact, they unite, they don't fight amongst themselves. And I think that I always wonder why we can't, and I think that we can. And what you're describing is a true issue, especially on the left. There's a lot of infighting. A lot of that was, I think, caused by external damaging forces. The CIA, the FBI, COINTELPRO, damaged our movements to the point where they don't really fear the left. And of course, now there's an upsurge, I would say, since the 2008 recession, where, the lack of economic opportunity has radicalized a lot of people. And then Trump becoming president has also galvanized a ton of young people, especially into action. But I think that the key, and it's it sounds a little bit like a very woo new agey response, but I do think we have to keep the end goal in front of us, and that we have to cooperate. And sectarianism and breaking up into our little factions is only going to take us so far. I think we can still organize in the way that we want to in our smaller groups, but when it comes time to make important decisions, and I certainly think we're in a period of revolutionary change, and it's not time for squabble. And I think that it's time for us to just kind of forgive if bad language is used, and explain and move on from it. But it's a great question, and it's one that we have to always, I think, keep in mind, because it truly, this kind of non-cooperation has hurt us quite a bit, and I think it'll continue to, unless we find a way to move forward.
I kind of want to wrap with this idea of resistance, fighting versus building. This idea of resisting Trump, or hashtag the resistance and things like that. Do you feel that kind of puts us always back on our heels? Like we're always just sort of fighting, we're reactionary in a lot of ways, versus the idea of building an alternative to what we're seeing here, and the importance of doing both. But how do you feel that those two should blend in terms of our organizing work and our work as citizens as well?
When you have your back against the wall, what can you do than to react. I mean, or that's really the first thing we do is resist. But we definitely should do more than resist. And the Democratic Party has famously co-opted any resistance that working people are offering, and hence their hashtags, and hence their well-funded corporate movements that speak of resisting, even though there's no real struggle or no real movement building characteristic to it. But then there's also actual grassroots, local, activism that's going on, where people are truly building community and building solidarity and building trust, which I think is very, very important for our movement. But all the work we do, I think, should be geared towards building something for the something for not just now but also for the distant future. And I keep kind of going back to needing to change the system, but actually there's a lot of work that needs to be done after that point too. I don't think that if we nationalize all the banks, or take over into public ownership all the enterprises there are, that'll rid us of all our problems. It might rid us of our economic problems, but then we'll still have the problem of sexism, racism, the way we treat each other, the way we talk, everything that we do comes from this sort of dominant ideology, the hegemony of capitalism that we don't even really think about. I think subconsciously, sometimes we judge our friend that doesn't have a job, and then we don't think about the fact that they might not have opportunity, truly to be able to find a job. Things like that. I think that we have a lot of sort of relearning and retuning to do, and I think we can start that by being cooperative and helping each other out and teaching each other what we know. And it might feel like we're not winning in the short term, but I do think that working towards these reforms in order to give people at least the bare minimum that they need to stand on their 2 feet and start to have the energy to focus on building movements and doing more. I think that those of us who have more today should really be doing that in order to get all of us sort of elevated to a position and a level of consciousness where we can truly unite to start to dismantle the horrible aspects of the current system we live in.
To learn more about industrial workers of the world, visit iww.org. And to learn more about Socialist Alternative, visit socialistalternative.org. And if you're in DC, you can find out more info about my performance and the other scheduled events here in the city by visiting my site, artkillingapathy.com, and clicking on Performance. Also, be sure to check out the site list in the description for a link to more background information on the history of May Day. And that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Thanks so much for watching. Please do, as always, spread and share this with all your friends, foes, and people that you don't know. Again, as I've already mentioned, check out that last slide and the show description to find sites mentioned in this week's show, and for interim updates as well as posted videos, images, and articles, be sure to follow us and visit us on social media. From the Devil's Den, workers of the world unite and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, donate at Occupy.com/donate. If you'd like to donate directly to Act Out, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left one of you motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been begging up inch by inch, we got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since you pushed and served my shove. I'm not a violent man, but I